In this lecture, I plan to deal with the religious changes wrought by the career of Alexander the Great and by the Macedonian kings who followed him. It's a difficult topic to deal with, and it's far easier for us to deal with, say, the administrative and social institutions created by Macedonian kings to rule their realms in the former Persian Empire. You can see at least some kind of change or unity emerging from those activities. Also, economic activity leading to the prosperity and change of economic relationships, the development of markets, a new relationship between the countryside and city, which generates a prosperity that acts as another unifying force for what we call the Hellenistic world. Religion is much more difficult to define. And this is in part a problem of our own perceptions. We are dealing with two issues here that make this particularly difficult. First is our own notions of religion. As heirs to the religions of Abraham, we have notions of religion that are premised on a transcendent single divinity outside the forces of nature. We are looking at a world of not only polytheism, where many cults are worshipped, but also the fact that the gods are ever present. This was certainly believed by Alexander and all the Macedonians. Sacrifices to the gods brought the gods immediately to the presence of the Macedonian army. Portents, oracles were taken as various ways of the gods, the immortals, communicating with humans. And above all, this notion that the distinction between the divine and the mortal is not very clearly drawn, and at least in the Greek world, one can cross it, such as Alexander or some of the Macedonian kings. I discussed earlier all those issues of ruler cults. So we have to abandon many of our own notions of what we think religion is. Furthermore, ancient religion is far more communal in ritual and practice. Rituals by the community are all important, and that is something difficult for us as heirs to really the intellectual traditions of Europe since the 17th century in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, where religion increasingly becomes an issue of personal conscience and choice, and also deals with the deep spiritual sense of the greater meaning of God and the great beyond. This is not necessarily so for ancient religion. It doesn't mean that the ancients were any less pious, it's just that their piety was defined differently. It was much more communal and public, and it was very, very much concerned with ritual, and if you did not follow ritual, the gods became angry and punished you. There's also a second assumption in all of this, and that is Alexander the Great's career was dramatic. It brought Greeks and Macedonians in contact with many other peoples, and invariably they compared the gods of Greece to the gods of these various peoples of the Persian Empire. And in that comparison, many scholars have argued that the gods of Greece were found wanting, and that the religious unity of the Hellenistic world or period or civilization, however you want to characterize it, was ironically one of decline in the belief of the Hellenic gods, the substitution of those public and communal cults devoted to the Olympian gods, the gods of the city, with new gods. Either these are foreign gods from the lands of the former Persian Empire, or they are the reinvention of pre-Greek cults, such as Demeter and Kore. Often they're known as mystery cults. We'll get into that in a moment. That is, cults with specific rites of initiation. And these cults are somehow different from the usual Greek cults, which are essentially family and civic in origin. One chooses to join these cults, hence the need for the mystery rites, the initiation rites. This line of argument, which still dominates the whole discussion of religion in the Hellenistic and in the following Roman age, is ultimately tied up with another perception of moderns, and that is not only do we have problems understanding what religion meant to the ancients, we also see the religious changes from the time of Alexander the Great on as representing a major departure in religious life in the Near East and the Mediterranean world, which is somehow preparatory to the emergence of Christianity. Ultimately, religion in the Hellenistic age is studied as a way of understanding how did the ancient gods change perceptions of these gods that would lead the peoples of the ancient world to abandon their ancestral gods, their notions of religion, and embrace a single monotheistic faith. This is one of the great changes of antiquity. In my mind, it is one of the watersheds. The emergence of Christianity, then followed by Islam, the near emergence of the Manichaean faith, which is essentially the third of the monotheistic faiths. It just didn't capture a monarchy and establish itself the way Islam and Christianity did. But nonetheless, how did the ancient cults give way to this whole new conception of religion? Well, Alexander was looked upon as initiating these changes for two reasons. First was the whole question I dealt with of Alexander having some kind of wider sense of the unity of mankind, of knocking down barriers that had divided barbarians and Greeks, that is the distinction Aristotle would draw, and later philosophers, particularly members of the Stoic philosophical school, but also Cynics, Epicureans, and later Aristotelians and Platonists. All of them looked to Alexander as the man of action who created a new world order, cosmopolis, as they might call it. That is a city of the world, a citizen of the world, all of those sort of images. And that meant the interaction and exchange of religious ideas between the Greeks and the people of the Near East. And as I mentioned, this led to various types of conclusions. One is a more tolerant attitude to cults. It's usually argued. Alexander himself saw the cults of the Near East as somehow representing gods familiar to him. Melkart at Tyre was obviously Heracles. They both had clubs as their attributes. And this is a process very often known as syncretism. That is, identifying the gods of the Near East with their Greek equivalents, or later with their Roman equivalents. And this is seen as somehow a step in the direction of monotheism, or perhaps something known as henotheism, which in the history of religion refers to a single divine force that is represented by the many traditional gods. That divine force would reveal himself as Zeus to the Greeks, as Amun to the Egyptians, as Ahura Mazda to the Persians, and so forth. But ultimately the same divine force. And who among the mortals is to question why the god so revealed himself in the distant past in this guise to the Egyptians as opposed to another guise to the Greeks, and therefore all the cults have a certain equal value. And when one is in Egypt, you worship this divine force along Egyptian lines, in Greece along Greek lines, and so forth. So it's often seen that these types of religious attitudes come out of Alexander's conquest. Alexander himself is practicing these types of notions as he venerates different divinities across the Persian Empire. Then there is the other profound change, and that is the establishment of Greek cities in the Near East, the promotion of wider trade routes, and ultimately these Macedonian kingdoms that see the transmission of the gods from their original locations. The most common pair are Serapis and Isis. Serapis is the Greek form of Osiris. Isis is his consort and wife. These divinities go back deep into Egyptian history. Osiris is essentially representation of a god of vegetation in the underworld. The pharaoh, in effect, becomes Osiris upon his death. And they are hailed as the patron divinities of Alexandria in Egypt, the city established by Alexander the Great. And the cult is promoted by Ptolemy I in particular. And this cult is exported across the Mediterranean world. We have cults to Serapis and Isis everywhere in the Aegean, and eventually in Roman Italy, as far distant as Spain, and even in the later Roman age on places like the Rhineland and the Danube, areas you wouldn't expect to find this Egyptian couple being worshipped. And there are similar cults that are documented the same way. This is a result, again, of Alexander's activities. Now, I should note, before I go on this, that when Alexander worshipped these gods in the Near East, there's a certain proviso that should be made. He did respect all of these cults, but it is clear from the sources that he worshipped those gods as avatars or representations of the Greek gods. Alexander, in his religious beliefs, was Greek. He was really Homeric. He really understood the gods as they would have been depicted in Homer, as figures who encouraged great heroic figures. They would not be the gods of philosophers. And so in that regard, a lot of these changes attributed to Alexander's activities have to be seen as more results than policies, because as far as I can tell, Alexander's religious values were extremely traditional and very, very Homeric. Well, with that proviso, the notion that these changes wrought by Alexander led to a major religious change has been a common theme in studying the history of religion from the time of Alexander the Great to the conversion to Christianity by the Emperor Constantine in 312 AD, which is another subject for another time. This notion was pioneered by a brilliant Belgian philologist named Frans Coumont, who wrote his first significant book at the depressing age of, I think, 27. His book is still in print. In fact, he has 3 other books in print. And how many scholars can claim that after 100 years of writing your pivotal work at the age of about 26 or 27, when most scholars usually do it in our field at age maybe 55 or 60, still has 4 books in print. Coumont was a genius in his time. He had a phenomenal control over literary text. He was one of the first students of ancient religion who seriously looked at the archaeological evidence, and he played a role in understanding the history of religion, which is comparable to the role that Rostovtsev played in understanding the economic history of the ancient world. Coumont looked at a vast body of evidence. He did not come to it with a preconceived notion, and he concentrated initially on the study of the god Mithras, a figure coming out of the Persian tradition, and this cult of Mithras becomes extremely popular in the Roman age. He came to the conclusion that the god Mithras in the Roman age was the same god of the Persian texts, the Avesta, and those are the religious texts of Zoroastrianism today that have been transmitted in their Middle Persian form. They really date from the Sassanidid period, that is the 3rd and 4th century AD, but they do go back, we believe, to earlier periods, and that what had happened is that this Persian god had been embraced as one of the so-called Oriental or mystery cults. Oriental is an unfortunate term. It's an old-fashioned term. It's still found in the literature, but it means essentially a Near Eastern cult that has been modified and adopted for a Greek audience and later a Roman audience. The study of the cult of Mithras led him to a reevaluation of all sorts of cults in the Hellenistic world, and also to look at the philosophical systems that emerged in the Hellenistic world, notably the traditions of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism, which were all philosophical schools that flourished in the 4th and 3rd century BC. The Stoic values were eventually embraced by the Romans, but all of these religious traditions reinterpreted the traditional Greek gods in philosophical terms, sometimes in extremely abstract terms, such as Stoicism, where they were essentially a divine force, a rational logos, or in the case of Epicureanism, it was essentially an issue whether there were gods at all, and really it's rather meaningless, and humans should practice a moral system without reference to the gods, because that's the most appropriate thing to do and leads to the least amount of difficulty in one's life. One should enjoy one's life. Unfortunately, Epicureanism is taken by moderns as a passport to hedonism, and it wasn't in its original form. So Coumont's examination of these cults and philosophies led to some very important conclusions. And I'll summarize here. First and foremost, that the traditional public gods, and presumably the family gods, lost their force in the world created by Alexander. This was a result of the export of the gods of the Near East in very, very attractive forms, such as Isis and Serapis. And there are cults of Isis and Serapis all along the eastern Mediterranean by 250 BC. There's actually an impressive temple to Serapis at Ephesus. Usually it's not visited by the tourists, but it's built in the 3rd century BC because of the city's connection to Alexandria. It also led to the reemergence of ancient divinities that had very little to do with what are thought to be the rational civic gods of Greece. These included such cults as Cybele, the great mother goddess of Asia Minor, mysterious divinities from Asia Minor such as Maine and Larbrenus, who really didn't translate into very easy Greek equivalents. The various astral divinities of the Near East, such as Astarte. Above all, cults that were regarded as somehow pre-Greek, enthusiastic, not really part of the Greek civic tradition, such as Dionysus, Demeter and Persephone, who were worshipped at Eleusis, that all of these cults gained force at the expense of the civic divinities, Zeus, Athena, Hera, Apollo, the gods that were well known from the public inscriptions and festivals since the time of Homer, or actually the Archaic Age, the generation of Homer, after Homer. Well, this is a very appealing view. It ironically turns Alexander's career on its head, because Alexander, in effect, conquered the Persian Empire very much as a Hellene in his religious outlook, and as a result of those conquests, he compromised the traditional religion of the Greeks at the expense of these new mystery cults or enthusiastic cults, which gave a unity, a religious unity to the Hellenistic world, but by no means what was anticipated. This vision has a great deal to recommend itself. There is some evidence that does point in this direction. One of the most famous would be the Rosetta Stone, the key to reading Egyptian hieroglyphs, which I've mentioned before, and it was a decree of King Ptolemy V, recording in 196 BC the proper traditional worship to Ptah, the god of wisdom, the god of Memphis, who goes back into the early Old Kingdom of Egypt, as well as Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And there is a Macedonian king venerating the traditional gods of Egypt. There are examples of the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, and she is best known from a poem by the Latin poet Catullus, who claims that the cult was, again, a wild, enthusiastic cult, not at all corresponding to Greek or Roman notions of religion, and that she was served by priests who had castrated themselves as eunuchs in honor of this goddess, and there's a whole story about her lover, Attis, who did this. It's one of the most dramatic poems in Catullus, although it's very questionable whether it actually records an actual practice, or is this the Romans assuming something about the cult. In any event, that cult was adopted in Rome itself. It was translated to Rome in 204 BC. The great sanctuary at Pessinus in Phrygia was revered by Greeks of all types. It came under the protection of the Attalid kings, and the cult of Cybele expanded far beyond the bounds of Asia Minor and Phrygia. She was worshipped in a number of Greek cities, and Greek divinities were assimilated. And all of these cults, these mystery cults, are seen as having several common features that made them more attractive in the world of the Hellenistic age. One was the initiation rites I mentioned. Mustiai means initiation rites. You chose to belong to the cult, is the argument. That these rites varied a great deal. There was a so-called taurobolium, a blood sacrifice that some would attribute to the cult of Cybele, or sometimes it's argued it's Mithras, but that's not true. It's Cybele. Later Christians saw it as a perversion of baptism of blood. We have reports of all sorts of enthusiastic festivals associated with these cults, particularly the cult of Isis and Serapis, in which you have participants with cymbals and all sorts of exotic instruments, and there's an enormous amount of rejoicing. The same is true with the cult of Dionysus, with the bacchantes and the maenads of mythology being played by humans. It's a great celebratory, enthusiastic cult. In fact, the word enthusiastikos in Greek is associated with the cult of Dionysus very early. It means that one is being filled up by the god himself and achieves an ecstatic state, that is ecstasis. You stand outside yourself, you're able to perform miracles. And the argument of Cumont was, the cult sort of got toned down and turned into Athenian drama, but it reasserts itself in its early pre-Greek form, and it becomes one of the quintessential mystery cults. It is also argued that these cults had two other qualities in common, or two other aspects in common, and that is, one, some kind of personal relationship between the divinity and the worshiper, that there was a bond formed by the initiation, and second, the belief that there was a reward based on piety. This could be either an afterlife or renewal of life. It's not always necessarily an afterlife, but there was some sort of special privilege that would be extended to the worshippers. Of course, many scholars would seize upon this as the beginnings of a yearning for immortality that eventually lead you down to the path of Christianity. You could see that argument easily developed out of Cumont's work. Well, The image is extremely satisfying, and as I've stated, it's an image that still persists very strongly in the literature today, but there are an increasing number of scholars who study the history of ancient religion as opposed to the history of the emergence of Christianity, which are not the same thing. And I am a student of this issue, particularly in the Roman world and particularly in the region of Asia Minor, where a lot of this so-called synthesis, syncretism, and religious change took place. As appealing as this picture is, it rests on certain modern perceptions and prejudices which I don't think are supported by the sources. First, Cumont and his successors. They wrote about the spiritual change of the Hellenistic world in the shadow of their own experience. They were products of the late industrial age of the 19th century and early 20th century that saw the emergence of enormous cities, the disorientation that came in the early stages of industrialization in North America and Western Europe, the growth of cities as overcrowded, soulless institutions in which many lost traditional values and faith, and these would have to be substituted in various ways. This vision was closely tied to the promotion of Greek cities across the ancient Near East by Alexander and his successors. And as I've noted in an earlier lecture, this is grossly overstated. These cities do not at all correspond to the type of cities we would have in the industrial age, far from it. The vast majority of these cities would be ranked as towns in terms of their population. And furthermore, I've stressed that in their economic activities, they are closely tied to the countryside, and I would argue the same is true for religious activity. That is, the gods are always close to the city, and there are still cities in Turkey that I know that convey that image. One could go to the ancient city of Nicaea, Iznik today. It is surrounded by a Byzantine wall that stands on a Roman wall, that stands on the Hellenistic wall. It was a capital city of the Bithynian kings, modeled after a Greek city. As soon as you walk out of that city, you're in the countryside. The farming goes up almost to those walls. And that you have to keep in mind with most of these ancient cities, that they are not anything remotely like the great cities of the modern age, and therefore to see the kind of disorientation and falling away from civic values and traditional cults is overstated. Far from it. The main divinities of any ancient city usually resided in a sanctuary outside the city. And the civic festival was bringing that cult statue into the city in a series of parades that would lead it through the city and hit all the important points and end up in the theater, where there would be distributions to the citizens, and could be grain, it could be money to the males. The women would get perfume and other types of objects, all handed out by the civic elites. And the god would be worshipped by sacrifices. The god would make an epiphany and would appear in the statue and promise to reward her worshipers or his worshipers, depending on the divinity. This could easily be reconstructed in a city such as Ephesus, which many have visited, and which the great cult statue would have been marched out from the Artemisium, today represented by a single column, would move around to the west end of this, the east end of the city, the Magnesia Gate, and then descend eventually to the theater. Those who have lived in the city of New Orleans and witnessed the various festivals of Mardi Gras and other local festivals understand very clearly of what I am speaking. That these are civic cults that are family events. There is a full rejoicing of the citizen body. And the public cults of the Greek cities were hardly the rational, remote protestations of political loyalty that one would gather from Cumont's works or many of the critics of ancient religion. Instead, those types of traditions still survive very much in the Mediterranean world, in parts of Latin America, in Catholic Europe, and above all, as I said, in the city of New Orleans, where I, by a series of accidents, happened to obtain my academic position, and when I attended the first Mardi Gras festival, I understood it immediately. This is like being in Ephesus in the year 100 BC. It made total sense to me. So you have to take that qualification in first with Cumont, that when Alexander and the Macedonian kings established Greek cities in the Near East, these cults were very much in line with the cults of the cities in the Greek homeland, and this did not in any way necessarily result in these cults being vitiated by coming into contact with other divinities. Far from it. The archaeological evidence suggests that the Greco-Macedonian gods were seen as the model after which native peoples assimilated their gods. This is a whole approach that still needs to be studied in greater detail, but just several incidental studies, for instance, the excavations of the city of Hierapolis, today Pamukkale in Turkey, one of the favorite hotspots of the Roman age, and today because of its spas. The local god there, Labrenus, was essentially assimilated to Apollo. And while a very powerful pre-Greek Anatolian god, he assumed the guise of a Greek god as a result of the patronage by the Attalid kings, and later by Roman senators, and finally by Roman emperors. The same would be true of the Roman god Mithras. Mithras, the source of Cumon's argument, was a cult that was apparently invented in Italy, probably at the end of the 1st century A.D. It was, in all of its aspects, essentially a Roman cult with a Persian veneer. Mithras was the god of oaths. He was seen as particularly worthy for members of the imperial customs service as well as soldiers, and it was closely tied to loyalty to the imperial army and also to the Roman emperor, and had very little to do with some kind of proselytizing cult that was worshiping a sense of immortality or initiation that was in opposition with the traditional cults. One could be a member of the cult of Mithras as well as worship the gods of the city, the locale where you were stationed. And there's enough evidence to indicate it. The vast numbers of inscriptions that document the spread of the cult of Isis and Osiris. When one looks at the names of those people who erected the inscriptions, they are ultimately Greeks from Alexandria or the neighbors of Greeks from Alexandria. And what they are doing is worshiping their god from Alexandria in a new location. And furthermore, it is also demonstrated that the god Serapis and Isis were really Greek gods based on Egyptian gods. You're really looking at a fundamentally Greek cult with an Egyptian veneer. And finally, those pre-Greek cults such as Demeter, Kore, Dionysus, and others, which have initiation rites and somehow promise salvation if you live a worthy life, and some would even argue we're redefining impiety as an act of moral sin as opposed to just not performing the rituals. Those too are overdrawn. All of those cults are closely associated with specific cities. Bronze Age tablets now indicate that cults such as Dionysus, Demeter go back deep into the Bronze Age. They were always part of the Greek pantheon. There's nothing necessarily pre-Greek or non-Greek about them. And mystery cults, or mystery initiation rites, is an unfortunate term. We use the modern term in English, mystery, and it's used in Western European language to denote something that is uncertain or hidden, or is a certain type of novel in which the whodunit is revealed at the end. Mysteries merely mean initiation rites. And one wonders what the initiation rites meant. At Athens, these rites took place at Eleusis, and by the Hellenistic age, the entire Athenian citizen body was accommodated at the telesterion, where the mysteries were performed, and that would be thousands of Athenian male citizens who saw the entire drama played out, and I'm not sure that that constitutes a mystery at all. Mystery rites were simply special rites to a particular divinity, but in all other ways, these mystery cults studied by Cumont conform to the expectations of religion that would be found in the so-called civic and family cults. Instead, what Alexander wrought was a major move to the Hellenization of sacred space, to the adoption of games and festivals in the Greek style, and to the assimilation of the numerous native divinities across the Near East, at least to the regions west of the Euphrates, not in the Iranian regions, to their Greek counterparts. And that is the remarkable change that occurred in the age of Alexander the Great. Furthermore, these cults were often associated with veneration of either Alexander or Hellenistic monarchs and later Roman emperors, and that would be the political dimension to it. But fundamentally, what happened is the gods of Greece were seen as the gods to emulate, and any city that wished to be of any note would identify their divinities to those of the Greek divinities. This is, I think, where scholarship should be devoting itself, that the change was very noticeable, it was very dramatic, and it explains why the Romans are so easily can so easily accommodate these cults to their own religion. They simply piggyback on this tradition. And so as a result, the gods of Greece become, in effect, the gods of the Hellenistic world. And it's important to close with one thought. That is, it is very easy to underestimate the impact of these ancient rituals. And if anyone wants to get a sense of what these civic rituals are like, they should go to Turkey during the time of the Bayram Kubran, which is the great celebration of the near sacrifice of Isa by Abraham in the Islamic tradition. And that climaxes with the slaughtering of animals and the holding of a ritual meal among various Turkish families. I've been in Istanbul in that event, and the primordial power of the animal sacrifice and the worship to the divine powers and the thanksgiving that one has survived the year is something that has to be experienced. And it's very easy to underestimate that aspect of these civic cults. And that was the fundamental basis of all ancient religion: sacrifice to the gods, worship to the public places, and thanksgiving, but all the citizens were bound in the worship of those ancestral gods. And those were now gods conceived in their Greek form.